Most Christians, when you ask them what happens when you die, will describe something like this. Your soul leaves your body, goes to heaven, and then at some point down the road, there's a resurrection. And if you ask them where that picture comes from, they'll tell you the Bible. But it comes from Plato. Specifically, it comes from the Phaedo, Plato's dialogue on immortality of the soul, written around 360 BC, which argues that the body is a prison, death is the soul's liberation from it, and the philosopher's goal is to spend his life loosening the soul's attachment to the physical world. That same framework entered Christianity through the 2nd century writers who explicitly blended Platonic philosophy with Christian theology and weren't even trying to be subtle about it. They actually thought that the Greek reason and Greek revelation were complementary. They even said so in their own writings, and they built an anthropology that put the immortal soul at the center of the Christian afterlife picture. The problem is that that framework displaced a much older and more cleaner doctrine than the ancient world had already been working with for thousands of years before the 1st century AD. So here's what that older doctrine actually said. The body isn't incidental to who you are. It's constitutive of who you are. Death isn't liberation, it's a rupture of the whole person. And resurrection isn't a bonus event after the soul has already made it to heaven. It's the only actual solution to the problem of death. That's the real ancient Hebrew framework. That's what you find in the prophets, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the ancient Near Eastern traditions that predate the Bible by centuries, and in the Book of Mormon. And it's not the framework that most of Christianity is operating on today. Before we get too far, I want to say thank you to everyone watching and supporting the channel, and all of those behind the scenes making things happen that I couldn't otherwise do myself. I'm constantly humbled by the amount of help and guidance that I've gotten during this journey, so again, thank you. I couldn't do any of this without you. And finally, if you're interested in helping support the channel, please consider donating through the Ko-Fi and the PayPal links that are linked in the channel description. Please don't ever feel pressure, but just know that it really helps me continue this work, and if you're unable to contribute that way, please like and share these videos with someone that might need to hear this. Now, what I want to do in this episode is follow that displacement that I just mentioned. Where did the original doctrine come from? What happened to it? And what does it look like when the pieces are reassembled? Before we get into it, I'll touch on the sourcing. As always, the scholars I draw on in this video are listed in the pinned comment below, and most of them are not LDS. Today, I'll mostly be using a Swedish Hebrew Bible scholar at Lund University, a German Egyptologist at the University of Constance, the leading Western specialist in Zoroastrianism from the University of London, an Orthodox Jewish scholar who edited the Dead Sea Scrolls publication project, an Anglican bishop who has spent his career arguing that Western Christianity lost the original resurrection doctrine to Greek philosophy, and a German Protestant church historian whose documentation of the Hellenization of Christianity is standard academic reading. None of them were trying to make a case for Joseph Smith. So if your response to what I'm about to lay out is that the academic record is wrong, you're not just disagreeing with me, but you're also disagreeing with the mainstream scholarly consensus across several independent fields. Every source is in the pinned comment. Look them up for yourself. I'm Alex Arnold. This is Moroni Standard. Everyone talks about the resurrection like it was a new idea that Jesus introduced. Was it? The short answer is a resounding no. The ancient Near Eastern world had been working with the structural pattern of death, descent, and return for a very long time before the 1st century. What Jesus did not do was introduce an unfamiliar concept to a world that had never considered it. He simply enacted something that appears, once you start looking at the primary sources, in almost every major ancient tradition that we have, encoded in theology and ritual for millennia before the 1st century AD. The Ugaritic Ball Cycle, which is a collection of texts from ancient Canaan, written in roughly 1400 BC and discovered at Ras Shamra in Syria in 1929, describes Baal, the storm god and lord of fertility, descending into death, being mourned and lamented, and then returning. Turgev Medinger, a Swedish scholar of the Hebrew Bible at Lund University, examined these primary sources specifically to address the question of whether dying and rising gods existed in pre-Christian antiquity. His conclusion in The Riddle of Resurrection was that the dying and rising patterns are documented in many primary sources, specifically for Dumuzi Tammuz in Mesopotamia, Baal in Canaan, and Melkart in Phoenicia. all of which were prior to any possible Christian influence. This is pretty significant beyond just the general comparative religion point, because the Ugaritic texts are written in a language closely related to Biblical Hebrew from the immediate cultural neighborhood of ancient Israel. So, the theological world that the Hebrew prophets were writing in and responding to already had this pattern embedded in it. Medinger is just working from the same ancient text that any mainstream scholar would cite. The Mesopotamian tradition goes back further still. The Descent of Inanna, a Sumerian text dating to approximately 1900 BC, describes the goddess Inanna descending into the underworld, dying, and being restored. And then, the Babylonian parallel, the Descent of Ishtar, follows the same architecture as well. Now, I'm not trying to say that Inanna is a theological equivalent of Christ or that these traditions are saying the same thing that Christianity says. My point is that the structural pattern of a divine figure descending into death, the world suffering in their absence, and they are finally mourned and returned, shows up across geographically separated civilizations in ways that really put a strain on the borrowing explanation. Now, of course, some of the traditions in the Near East cluster together. Mesopotamia, Canaan, and Egypt did have contact with each other, but the real question there isn't whether the pattern traveled, but why somehow this specific structural pattern traveled rather than the thousands of other possible frameworks. The most compelling are the traditions with no plausible transmission route to the ancient Near East at all. The Popol Vuh, the Mayan creation text, describes the hero twins Hunahpu and Xbalanque descending into the underworld Xibalba, dying and then rising, which is the same structural architecture as the Baal cycle and the Descent of Inanna, from a civilization with zero documented contact with the ancient Near East. Indigenous traditions across Polynesia and parts of Southeast Asia also preserve descent narratives in which divine or semi-divine figures enter the realm of death with the world's renewal tied to what happens there. Rather than general thematic similarities, the same specific pattern shows itself in primary traditions on opposite sides of the planet. In the past, I've argued that the oldest stories in the world aren't myths, they're a memory. Just remember that as we move forward today. That all sounds like something critics would push back on immediately, if they don't already. What's the main objection to the claim today? The main scholarly critique comes from Jonathan Z. Smith, one of the more influential historians of religion in the 20th century. In his 1987 entry on Dying and Rising Gods in Mircea Eliade's Encyclopedia of Religion, Smith argued that the whole category is largely a modern scholarly construct, essentially built backward from the Christian resurrection rather than derived carefully from the ancient evidence. Now, some parts of this are pretty strong, particularly against earlier scholarship like James George Fraser's The Golden Bough, which drew on some late or ambiguous sources. But Fraser was working before a lot of the primary material had been excavated or properly analyzed, so Smith's methodological critique of him is largely justified. But what Smith's critique doesn't touch is what Medinger established after engaging that exact material directly. Medinger went back to the primary Ugaritic sources specifically because of Smith's challenge, and his conclusion was that the dying and rising patterns exist in those texts for at least Dumuzi, Baal, and Melkart. The argument here doesn't actually depend on rehabilitating every figure that Fraser cited. It just depends on the structural convergence that Medinger confirmed from primary sources. And also worth noting, Smith's own subcategories of disappearing deities and dying deities actually preserve the structural pattern even while disputing the actual label. A deity that disappears and returns and a deity that dies and is mourned are both encoding the same ancient base intuition about death and what lies beyond it. The Restoration's position is that the intuition persisted precisely because it pointed towards something real and not because ancient peoples happened to share an imaginative coincidence. So, what about the Hebrew Bible specifically? Is resurrection actually there, or is it something that later readers projected backward into the text? Well, yes, it's there, and the way it develops across the Hebrew canon tells its own story. The earliest layers of the text describe death in terms of Sheol, the Hebrew word for the realm of the dead, a shadowy underworld where the dead exist in a kind of diminished state, not a place of punishment or reward. It's not hell or heaven in the modern Christian sense. In fact, death in the Hebrew framework isn't the departure of a soul from a body at all. It's the cessation of nephesh, which is a Hebrew word that the King James Bible translates as soul, but which actually means the whole living being, the unified person. You don't have a nephesh, you are a nephesh. When you die, the whole person dies. This is all important to understanding why resurrection in the Hebrew framework is not a supplement to death, but the only possible resolution of it. Because a disembodied soul ascending to a spiritual heaven isn't a solution by any means. According to death in this framework, it's reduced to a Greek consolation prize. The actual Hebrew solution is the restoration of the whole person. And on top of this, if you're a Christian, haven't you ever wondered why you'd need a body at the resurrection if your soul is already in heaven having a perfectly good time? It's not a trick question. It's a pretty glaring incoherence that sits inside the tradition that absorbed Greek anthropology without fully working out any of the implications. Let's look at Ezekiel 37, the Valley of Dry Bones. It was written in the 6th century BC, and it's the most vivid extended treatment of resurrection in the pre-exilic period. Isaiah 26:19 states directly that the dead will rise. And Daniel 12:2, written around 165 BC, is the most explicit statement in the Hebrew canon about resurrection. Many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. By the time of the Second Temple period, roughly 515 BC to 70 AD, resurrection had become the mainstream Pharisaic position, while the Sadducees rejected it and were the religious minority. When Jesus spoke about resurrection, he was engaging in a live theological debate that had been running for centuries. He wasn't introducing something new. And finally, the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, added further confirmation that this hope was not just marginal thought in pre-Christian Judaism. The Hodayot, the Thanksgiving hymns for the Qumran community, contain language about rising from the dust that maps directly onto Daniel 12 and anticipates the bodily restoration theology that Paul articulates in 1 Corinthians 15. Emmanuel Tov, the Orthodox Jewish scholar who edited the authoritative discoveries in the Judean Desert series, has documented this textual landscape with no stake in LDS or Christian conclusions. So, if this doctrine was ancient and well established, how did Christianity end up moving away from it? The mechanism runs in two different stages that reinforced each other. One was philosophical and one was institutional. But understanding how they work together is what actually makes that displacement intelligible. On the philosophical side of things, as Christianity expanded into the Greek-speaking world, Greek philosophical categories moved into Christian theology. In Plato's framework, particularly the Phaedo, the body is a kind of prison, basically a material cage that corrupts the soul's capacity for pure rational thought, and death is the liberation of the soul from that corruption. But that framework is the direct opposite of the Hebrew nephesh anthropology, where the body is not a problem to be escaped, but constitutive of who you are. It's also the direct opposite of the resurrection. Because if the body is the problem and death is the liberation, then the resurrection is giving the problem back permanently. But how does that work? If the body is a prison, then the resurrection is basically an eternal prison sentence. Adolf von Harnack, the German Protestant church historian whose History of Dogma is standard academic reading on this period, documented what he called the acute Hellenization of Christianity. The gradual process by which the immortal soul, a concept with no real basis in the Hebrew Bible, moved in and started doing the theological legwork that resurrection was supposed to do. You can see it very clearly in Justin Martyr's writings from around 155 AD, where Justin describes the soul as naturally capable of beholding God and uses Platonic categories to explain the soul's nature, while simultaneously affirming resurrection in the same body of work. Both frameworks coexist totally unresolved in the same exact 2nd century Christian writer. That unresolved coexistence is exactly what Harnack was documenting. So, if the soul is naturally immortal and goes directly to its reward or punishment at death, then the resurrection becomes, at best, just an afterthought. The retrieval of a body that the soul has already gotten along fine without and doesn't actually need. On the institutional side, the most important figure is Augustine of Hippo. His theological output in the late 4th and early 5th centuries shaped Western Christian thought more than most anyone else, and Augustine also came to Christianity through a prior Neoplatonic formation. He had spent many years working through Plotinus before he ever worked through Paul, and he never fully left that formation behind. His understanding of the soul emphasized its immortality and its priority over the body in ways that consistently subordinated the resurrection to the soul's actual ongoing existence. He affirmed bodily resurrection doctrinally, because he wasn't allowed to deny it, but in his framework the soul had already survived death, and the resurrection was more confirmatory than essential. This is, in a fairly direct sense, what happens when a Neoplatonist writes the theology that most of Western Christianity then inherits. Now, before anyone says it, yes, the creeds formally affirm bodily resurrection. The Nicene Creed says resurrection of the body, and the tradition never fully officially abandoned it. But what I'm describing isn't a formal doctrinal denial, but a functional displacement, where the soul survival framework moved in alongside the resurrection doctrine, then took over the practical work of explaining what happens at death, and then left the resurrection without any kind of coherent role to play. You can see this in something as ordinary and simple as a Christian funeral. The comfort offered is almost never about the resurrection. It's about the soul being with God now. They say things like, he's in a better place, or she's at peace, or they're at home now. But the resurrection, if mentioned at all, is a distant future event that barely features in the actual pastoral language of death and grief. So, soul survival is doing the actual theological work, and the resurrection is an afterthought. N.T. Wright, working from inside the Anglican tradition, makes exactly this observation. His published work, The Resurrection of the Son of God, is a detailed academic case made over 817 pages that Western Christianity progressively lost the original bodily resurrection doctrine to Platonic philosophical pressure while continuing to affirm it in the creeds. Keep in mind that Wright is Anglican. He's just describing a loss from inside the tradition that he's defending. So what specifically got lost when that happened? There are two big things that the ancient record preserves clearly and that the Greek displacement erased. The first is the Hebrew understanding that the body is constitutive of the person rather than incidental to it. D&C section 88 verse 15 covers this when it explains that the spirit and the body are the soul of man. Rather than being something coined by Joseph Smith, it's just the Hebrew nephesh anthropology that describes the whole living being. The same concept that the Greek philosophical tradition spent several centuries displacing. The practical consequence for this is that in the Hebrew framework, death really is a catastrophe, not a liberation. Resurrection is the only real answer to what death actually is, and it definitely isn't a retrieval event for a soul that has already moved on. The second preservation is the graduated and differentiated nature of resurrection. The ancient world didn't think of the afterlife as binary, meaning that heaven was for the righteous and condemnation was for everyone else, with nothing in between. But Daniel 12:2 already describes differentiated outcomes. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 40 and 41 then describes different degrees of resurrection glory, including celestial bodies and terrestrial bodies, with different glories varying as the sun varies from the moon and the moon from the stars. The mainstream Christian reading treats this as a poetic description of different resurrection body qualities. They say it's the same destination, just more or less glorified, but still all the same place. But that reading forces Paul's cosmological language into a much narrower box than he himself is using. The Greek word that he uses for celestial, eperonios, describes a cosmological category in Paul's broader usage. This is not a metaphor for varying degrees of polish on a single destination. Paul is actually describing a differentiated cosmos with differentiated destinations, and D&C 76 develops that framework into 3 degrees of glory in full. That reading of Paul also isn't an LDS innovation. It's what the text actually says at the level of its own cosmological vocabulary, but it largely disappeared from the mainstream tradition as the binary heaven-hell theology consolidated. I said that the pieces scattered rather than disappeared, so where do you actually find them? Before I get into the scholarship for this one, let's get personal, because it's relevant as to how I'm coming at this argument. Before I ever took the LDS Church seriously as something worth examining, I spent years going through ancient mythology and religion on my own. And this pattern turned up everywhere. Asia, the Pacific Islands, the Levant, Europe, Norse mythology, Egyptian ritual, Mesopotamian literature. Almost every tradition I looked at had some version of a divine figure descending into death, being mourned, and then returning. I wasn't looking for a convergence. I was even actively looking for the places where the pattern broke down by trying to find the traditions that didn't have it and trying to explain it away as cultural diffusion or common human psychology. I was actually a big Sam Harris fan, but at a certain point, the geographic spread and structural consistency of that pattern stopped yielding to any of those explanations. So, none of this is confirmation bias. It's the plain conclusion that I kept arriving at when I tried to falsify it. Now, the thread that eventually moved me towards serious research on the LDS Church specifically was Enoch. The Book of Enoch, also known as First Enoch, is an ancient Jewish text that is now excluded from the biblical canon. This scripture had resurrection theology, divine council theology, and a cosmological framework that matched what I'd been finding across every tradition that I'd studied. And then I'd found that Joseph Smith had been teaching from an Enochic framework, but in the 1830s. He produced the Book of Moses with material that corresponds to First Enoch very specifically, like Enoch receiving visions of the divine council, Enoch seeing God weeping over the suffering of his children, and Enoch building Zion and being translated, to name a few. All of this is content that matches the Enochic similitudes, and it's related to texts not available in any English translation that Joseph Smith could have accessed during his time. And the correspondence between these two sources isn't a general religious overlap. It's a specific theological architecture that scholarship has only recovered from the ancient texts in the 20th century. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because this argument isn't something that I built after the fact to defend a conclusion that I'd already reached. I found all of this evidence before I ever found the church. So let's talk about the Enochic tradition itself. This includes First Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and some related Second Temple texts. This literature contains explicit resurrection theology that predates the New Testament and develops well beyond what the canonical Old Testament actually preserves. For example, 1 Enoch chapter 51 verses 1 and 2 describes the earth giving back what has been entrusted to it, and Sheol returning what it has received. If you're unclear, this is describing bodily resurrection in language that matches Daniel 12 and actually anticipates Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. George Nicholsburg, a New Testament scholar at the University of Iowa, and not an LDS scholar, documented the resurrection theology of 1 Enoch in his Hermeneia commentary published by Fortress Press. The simple fact that 1 Enoch was largely excluded from the canon, even though it's quoted in the canon, means that a substantial portion of the ancient resurrection theology was simply unavailable through the actual canonical text. Now, the Egyptian tradition holds a different fragment, the Osiris Mysteries, which were conducted annually at Abydos for roughly 2,000 years. They enacted the death of Osiris, the lamentation of Isis, and the restoration of Osiris to life and kingship. Jan Osman, the German Egyptologist at the University of Constance, has documented the theological depth of the Osirian tradition, like the way it encodes a pattern of death, absence, and restoration that function as the paradigm for afterlife theology across the entire span of Egyptian civilization. The Osirian tradition began as a royal theology in which only the pharaoh fully participated in Osirian resurrection, with ordinary people having a derivative afterlife through ritual identification with Osiris rather than a literal and personal bodily restoration. The pattern was there, but the fully personal, literal, and embodied outcome never quite was. And then the Zoroastrian tradition, dating somewhere between 1500 BC and 600 BC, depending on the scholarly estimate, contains explicit bodily resurrection theology, including the Frosh Kareti, which is the final renovation of the world in which the dead are raised and the cosmos is restored to its original state. Mary Boyce, the leading Western scholar of Zoroastrianism at the University of London, documented this in her multi-volume A History of Zoroastrianism. Even at the conservative end of the dating range around 600 BC, that would still place explicit Zoroastrian bodily resurrection theology 6 centuries before the 1st century AD and contemporaneous with the Hebrew prophets articulating the exact same doctrine. The argument today isn't that the Hebrews borrowed from Zoroastrianism or vice versa. It's that these geographically separated traditions arrived at the same specific doctrine at roughly the same period. Each of these traditions preserved a different piece, but none of them assembled the whole picture, which is what makes the Book of Mormon so much more worth paying attention to. So what does the Book of Mormon have to do with all of this, and where does it fit into the resurrection theme? To answer that, we need to look at the timeline. The Book of Mormon records a sermon by Jacob, the brother of Nephi, whose family had left Jerusalem around 600 BC, that contains detailed bodily resurrection theology. It talks about the spirit and the body reuniting, corruption putting on incorruption, and the specific categories of resurrection. None of this is derived from New Testament sources. In fact, Lehi's family left Jerusalem before the New Testament was written, before Greek philosophy entered the theological picture, and before the Deuteronomistic scribes completed their edit of the Hebrew canon. But Jacob's resurrection theology is pre-exilic, which means that it's from the same original tradition that these scattered ancient fragments belong to, not borrowed from any of them. Let me explain what I mean about these ideas not being borrowed. The LDS framework has an actual explanation for why the same doctrine appears across traditions with no contact with each other, like Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, Mesoamerica, the Hebrew prophets, and the Book of Mormon. The explanation is that there was an original revelation given from the beginning of human history, and what we've been tracking across the ancient world are all fragments of it. Every tradition preserved different and sometimes the same pieces, but none of them retain the complete picture. The Restoration's claim is that Joseph Smith reassembled what had been there from the start. Jonah Barnes, an LDS writer, documented in The Key to the Keystone a structural parallel between Jacob's resurrection sermon and the Book of Baruch, an apocryphal text that was not available to Joseph Smith in 1830. And yes, I'm aware that Barnes is not a credentialed scholar in these fields, but if you're a fan of my channel here, then it shouldn't matter, because neither am I. What matters is whether the methodology holds up, and Q-source analysis is mainstream New Testament scholarship. See for yourself how it's applied to the synoptic problem, and then tell me that Barnes is doing something illegitimate. So what makes Jonah's case evidential rather than just a resemblance claim is that Baruch was not included in the King James Bible that Joseph Smith used. It was not widely available in early 19th century America in any translation, and the specific theological content that corresponds between Jacob and Baruch is not present in the canonical Old Testament texts that Joseph demonstrably had access to. The parallel here isn't that two religious texts sound a little similar, it's that the similarity is to content that Joseph had no documented access to. Barnes applies the same Q-source methodology that mainstream New Testament scholars use to trace literary relationships between texts by identifying passages too similar in structure, vocabulary, and theological content to be independent invention, and then inferring a common prior source. It's the exact same triangulation that scholars use to establish that Matthew and Luke drew on a common source when they share material that doesn't appear in Mark. Barnes is simply applying one of the mainstream methodologies, and the real value of what he documents lies not in the count of parallels or his personal degrees, but in the textual specificity of the similarities to content that was unavailable in 1830. So what does the Restoration actually reassemble that the ancient traditions taken individually couldn't? Each ancient tradition that preserved a fragment of this doctrine was working with a part of the picture. Egypt preserved the pattern, but not the fully personal embodied outcome. Zoroastrianism preserved the cosmic and bodily resurrection hope, but had no atonement theology, so no account of how the restoration is actually accomplished, just the expectation that it will be done. The Enochic tradition preserved graduated resurrection outcomes and celestial imagery, but was suppressed from the canon and largely inaccessible until 1947. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 preserves the most complete ancient statement when he talks about the body raised incorruptible, different degrees of glory, and Christ as the firstfruits. But the tradition that he was writing within lost that synthesis because of Greek philosophical pressure within a few centuries of his death. What the Restoration assembled from these fragments is the complete picture. It's a Hebrew anthropology that takes the body seriously as constitutive of the person, an atonement theology that explains why and how resurrection is possible, a graduated framework of outcomes matching both Paul's language and the ancient differentiated afterlife traditions, and a framework that extends to the redemption of the entire human family, which includes those who have never had the opportunity to receive the ordinances in this life. That last part is important because it's where the Restoration argument actually goes beyond just the theological recovery. Correct theology alone can't and doesn't perform an ordinance. But what the Restoration claims to have restored isn't only the right understanding of resurrection, but the actual priesthood authority through which that theology is enacted. like the authority to perform proxy ordinances on behalf of the dead, which is what makes the redemption of the whole human family even possible, rather than just conceivable in theory. Let's touch on Paul one more time as well. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 29, Paul's reference to baptism for the dead, is one of the most consistently unexplained verses in the New Testament. Paul mentions it as though his audience already knows what he's talking about, and uses it as evidence that the Corinthians themselves believe in resurrection. The creedal tradition has generated over 200 proposed interpretations of that single verse, over 200 for just one verse. The closest actual ancient parallel to the practice Paul describes is in the broader Enochic tradition, in which intercession is made on behalf of the dead before the divine council, seeking their judgment and their restoration. The tradition was hidden in a cave in Qumran until 1947, but Joseph Smith was teaching proxy ordinances for the dead decades before those texts were discovered. If your framework requires 200 guesses and no hard answers to explain one sentence that Paul apparently assumed his audience already understood, something is probably missing from your framework. The environmental argument that Joseph absorbed all of this from folk magic, masonry, and the general religious ferment of early 19th century America gets raised far too often, so I'll address that like always. This argument might explain general religious creativity, but it wouldn't explain the specific correspondence with pre-Christian ancient texts that weren't excavated until 1929, Dead Sea Scrolls material discovered in 1947, and Enochic resurrection theology that Nicholsburg finally documented in a major commentary in 2001. None of that content was in Joseph's environment. So here's where I want to land today, and I always want to be straightforward about what I'm claiming and what I'm not. The doctrine underlying the resurrection being the understanding that death is a problem requiring the restoration of the whole person, body and spirit together, is far older than Christianity and far more widespread than any single tradition that preserved it. It appears in the Ugaritic Baal cycle, it appears in the Descent of Inanna, it appears in the Osirian theology of Egypt, it appears in the Zoroastrian renovation of the world, it appears explicitly in Daniel 12, in Isaiah 26, in Ezekiel 37, in the Enochic literature confirmed by the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it appears in the Book of Mormon, which is claimed to be from a family that left Jerusalem before most of those ancient parallels were buried, forgotten, or canonized out of existence. I also said at the outset that I would prove that the soul goes to heaven picture that most Christians carry is not the biblical doctrine. That picture is Platonic anthropology, where the immortal soul survives death and ascends to a spiritual realm, and it entered Christianity through a process that Harnack documented and that Wright has spent his career arguing from inside the mainstream Christian scholarship. The Hebrew word nephesh means the whole living being. The Greek philosophical soul is a different concept entirely, and Christianity ended up absorbing the Greek version while still formally maintaining the Hebrew doctrine of bodily resurrection. The result is a tradition that affirms resurrection as a doctrine while operating on a soul survival assumption, and they've never quite been able to reconcile the two. That is the history of Christian theology as told by Christian historians. But I also want to be clear about what I'm not claiming. This episode is not an exhaustive treatment of the ancient evidence on resurrection, and the scholars that I've cited are not the only relevant voices in this conversation. This is a basic introduction to a question with a very deep academic literature behind it, and if you want to go further, the sources in the pinned comment are a reasonable place to start. For LDS members watching, the resurrection is one of the most historically defensible positions that your theology holds, and it is defensible from the ancient record and from mainstream non-LDS scholarship. It's not a blind faith thing, because the scholars who've documented the displacement of the original doctrine are not even LDS scholars. They had no reason to arrive at conclusions that support your position, but the fact that they did is worth trying to understand and be able to articulate. For people who are skeptical of LDS claims, you don't have to accept the LDS conclusions to engage honestly with the evidence. You can look at everything I've laid out here and still disagree about what it means. I respect that conclusion. What becomes much harder to sustain honestly is the version of the critique that treats Joseph as a con man who made up a bunch of new ideas because, at this point in the video, if you watch the whole thing, you've seen the specific evidence that this critique has to account for. like Mettinger's primary source confirmation that the dying and rising pattern predates Christianity in ancient texts unavailable in 1830, Harnack's documented displacement of the Hebrew resurrection framework by Platonic anthropology, Wright's internal Christian argument that Western theology lost the original bodily resurrection doctrine to Greek philosophy, the Enochic parallels that scholarship only recovered from Qumran in 1947, the Baruch correspondence that involves a text that Joseph had no documented access to, and Paul's reference to baptism for the dead that has 200 proposed interpretations that still haven't satisfactorily been explained. The pattern points in one direction. So, if your position requires you to not engage carefully, take a step back. Not as a reason to join the church or anything, but just as a reason to ask whether the caricature that you might be working from is actually accounting for the real data. And for anyone who came in simply curious about what Latter-day Saints believe, the LDS position on resurrection is that the spirit and the body together constitute the full person, that death is a genuine disruption of that whole, and that resurrection is the permanent restoration of the whole person in a glorified embodied state, and then calibrated, as Paul described, to the life that was lived. With multiple degrees of glory, not a binary heaven and hell, the dead redeemed through proxy ordinance and not simply abandoned, and the body honored as essential to eternal identity, not something to escape as a Platonic prison. That position has many ancient roots, and the scholarship has been confirming those roots more and more for over a century. Go check out the sources in the pinned comment for yourself. I'm Alex Arnold. This is Moroni Standard.